Kia ora and welcome to Bridge Talks Business with Milford, episode 15. Great to have you here. We're counting down to Christmas. No, not December 25th, November 27th, next Wednesday. That's the final RBNZ monetary policy statement and rate review. Has the economy been naughty enough for a big stocking filler in the form of an outsized rate cut, or are we, as many are predicting, set for a 0.5% cut pre-Christmas? This week, we're looking at robotic-assisted surgeries. Why aren't we using them here with more frequency in New Zealand, given our long wait times? But first, here's your top 5 business bits from the past 7 days. Number 1, the post-election stock highs are starting to come down. Investors now starting to worry about inflationary impacts and also general uncertainty through the transition period. Number 2, strong growth, though, in the US. The economic data there with retail sales growing solidly over the past few months, but inflation does remain sticky and above target. Number 3, China's showing signs of economic life after government moves to kickstart the ailing property market. The stimulus so far's failed to fire with investors, but growth will be key to improvement here. Number 4, and back home to New Zealand, data showing inward migration continuing to slow, with a trend of Kiwis leaving, more offset by an increase in foreign arrivals. And number 5, this week we have results from Nvidia, the largest stock in the world by market capitalization. These events are typically volatile affairs, and the outcome could set the tone for market trends into the end of the year. All right, and now it's time for our sit-down this week. Just a note that this segment is informational only and should not be considered financial advice. Now, we all know that New Zealand has a long wait list for planned surgeries, especially in some of our more rural areas. It's hard to recruit and retain qualified surgeons and staff. So why aren't we making better use of robotic-assisted surgeries? Could they be an answer for us? Who better to ask than Milford Analyst and medical doctor, Deb Lambie. Deb, it is great to have you back on the podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, I was thinking about this morning. Who needs surgeons? Do we just get rid of surgeons now that we've got robots?
That is a really interesting question. So interestingly, surgery has changed a lot over time. So if you think back to, I guess, the 1980s or even earlier, they were all done open. So you do a big cut and like a big open cut, so there'd be a big incision. And then what we saw is later on laparoscopic surgery developed, which is where you do small cuts and the surgeon is manipulating instruments. And then what we've seen more recently, actually over the last kind of 20 years or so, is what we call robotic-assisted surgery. And that's where you have a robot that is at the side of the patient and that is being controlled by a surgeon who is away at a console, and they use the console to magnify the surgical field so they can see what's happening 10 times the size, and then they manipulate the robotic arms, which have a greater range of motion as a human hand, and they also have technology to do more precise incisions, smaller cuts. So it's a space that's been evolving rapidly. We still need surgeons to actually,
Yes.
and then if things go wrong as well, the surgeons are always there to be able to step in.
Right.
So that's very important as
So
well.
it's obviously come a long way very quickly, but you still need a surgeon there. So is it actually more efficient? What's more efficient about it? Is it the fact that you're making smaller incisions and therefore saving time across a number of surgeries?
Yeah, and so what's really interesting about this is they've been collecting data on this for 20 years. And so when you have a new kind of indication or a new type of surgery approved, the surgeons have to be all trained up on how to do it. And initially, because it's so different from how it was done originally, there's not really any difference. But as the surgeons get better over time, what they find is that the procedures have smaller cuts, they have less blood loss, they have less complications for the patient, which means that the patients stay in hospital for a shorter period of time after, so they're discharged faster. So even though the robots themselves are very expensive, so the soft tissue robots are around $2.5 million each, actually, because patients have better outcomes and are sent home from hospital faster, overall, the cost when you use these robots actually comes down over time.
So I want to talk about the company companies that are profiting from this, that are doing well out of this, and also what it means for the cost of healthcare more generally, because obviously we're all getting older and we're all going to need more surgeries.
Yeah.
But are we doing it much in New Zealand? Like, how do we compare to the States or other places?
So that's another really interesting question. So if you look globally, if you look at soft tissue procedures, robotic procedures, about 10% or just under 10% of all soft tissue surgeries are done using a robot. And then if you look at the US, that's around 20% of soft tissue surgeries are done with a robot. But then if you look within that at the procedures that were approved first, or the earliest procedures to be done using a robot, for some of them, for example, a prostatectomy, so that's something to take your prostate out if you have prostate cancer, around 85% of those in the US are done using a surgical robot.
Wow.
Yeah, so it really varies. But then if you look at New Zealand, we don't have good data yet on how much or how common they are as a proportion overall. But we do know that we have these surgical robotics here. And Tauranga was the first hospital, which sounds like I was kind of surprised when I saw that, but Tauranga was the first hospital to get get an intuitive robot, and they're called Da Vinci. And then what we've seen is over time, Dunedin's got one, they're in Auckland. So they're now used over a broad range of procedures. But the kind of barriers to us having more would be the cost initially, because they're so expensive, and then also because the companies that develop these are in the US. So Intuitive Surgical is the market leader by far in robotic-assisted surgery. That means that surgeons in the US had access to these and were trained earlier, and the data was collected in the US earlier. So they're just further ahead in the adoption curve.
Right.
But what we expect is that over time, the rest of the world will follow what we've seen in the US.
And what have they seen in the US in terms of efficiencies, in terms of costs?
Yeah, so they are releasing data all the time, collecting data all the time. And what we know is that around the world, there's about 12 million procedures have been done on an intuitive surgical robot. There's 9,000 robots that have been installed. And every quarter, what the company does in its quarterly results is they publish, or they kind of highlight, new evidence that has been published in scientific journals. And so we know clearly now that they reduce the cost overall, they have better outcomes for patients, and that really they do actually deliver benefits for the overall healthcare system.
We're talking about soft tissue operations here, basically, at the moment, and you used to be a doctor yourself. Will we ever see open heart surgery and stuff being done by robots?
So this is really interesting. So what we are seeing is that within the soft tissue space, that they are looking to do different types of surgery, where they don't already have approvals, but also they're making different types of robots. So they have the original Da Vinci robot has 4 arms, and they have just developed what's called the Da Vinci SP, or a single port robot. And so that has just 1 arm. And so that's used for things like ear, nose and throat surgeries, and only needs 1 incision to be made. They also have a new robot, and it's called the Ion, and this is a flexible robot. So the other ones have big arms that are kind of like mechanical arms almost, but this is a flexible robot that can go in your throat and into your lungs and take a biopsy. And over time, that will be used to do lung operations. And then another space that we're seeing innovation is actually in orthopedics. And so that's different from soft tissue. This is surgeries that are done on bones.
Yeah.
And so for things like a knee replacement and a hip replacement, and it's different companies that are involved in this. So the leader is a company called Stryker, which is also a US company. And there's another company called Zimmer Biomet. And they have robots. And these are slightly different to the soft tissue robots. And how these work are, with the soft tissue robots, you have the console where the surgeon is, you have the patient that's there, and they kind of operate, they're not side by side. But with the orthopedic robots, the orthopedic surgeon is here, and the robotic arm is right beside the surgeon, and the robotic arm assists the surgeon in very precise cuts, and getting the alignment of the joints.
It's like a laser guide or something.
Yeah. And so it's much more side by side, whereas with the soft tissue procedures, they're working separately.
Can they be done, the soft tissue ones? You could have somebody in Wellington and somebody and the patient in Auckland?
So in theory, over time, it's thought that could happen, but at the moment, it's still in the same room. And that's so that if something goes wrong, the surgeon is there, and the surgeon knows how to do traditional operations and also to use the robot.
Step in if things go
Yeah.
like this.
Yeah.
So what? Okay, that's all very well and good. I don't feel that nervous about having something like that done so far.
Good.
What about in terms of the companies that you've mentioned? How are their valuations looking going into the future? If they are more efficient, if they are bringing costs down for hospitals and healthcare, and we are getting older and we are requiring more surgeries,
Yeah.
this sounds like something that's going to be in huge demand.
Yeah. And so if you look at soft tissue procedures, for example, so we know globally around 10% of surgeries are done with the assistance of a robot. By 2028, that's forecast to get to around 20%. And so if you think by 2028, that's still only 20% of global procedures. So there's still a huge runway for growth. And so they can increase the proportion of procedures that they already have approval on. So if you're doing prostatectomies, 85% in the US, but only a much smaller proportion here, that can go up. But then also we will see approvals in new types of surgeries come through, and then we have the new robots coming through. But a significant investor debate is the valuation of Intuitive Surgical. So we look at a multiple called the price to earnings ratio, and that for Intuitive is almost at 70 times. So these are very, very expensive shares. And so in order to justify that, you have to be very bullish and very confident on the runway for growth. So there's bulls or people who are very confident in that, who are happy to own Intuitive shares at these expensive valuations. And there's also people that say they're too expensive, even though it's a great quality company with a great runway ahead. We can't justify an investment.
You can't beat the old scalpel in a hand. But also, I guess it is quite a fragile thing. I mean, you look at automated cars in the United States, and when something goes wrong, it makes headlines, right? I mean, you can imagine one of these things going haywire, and what happens to the share price? I guess there are risks, are there?
Yeah, there would be risks, but it's something that, interestingly, so I have been following this company pretty closely for about 5 years now, and I haven't heard any examples of actually any time where something's gone wrong. And I think it's just such a highly regulated space. So for these robots to be used on people doing operations where if things go wrong, the consequences would be massive, they just have to be so careful. So it's not something that we've seen so far, but it's something the company's obviously investing in, making sure they prevent that happening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, in New Zealand, we would have our own requirements in terms of government regulation, etc., before anything could come in here.
Yeah.
Is it something that you think will revolutionise in any great way, say, New Zealand's healthcare system, particularly for those rural areas where we find it hard for, people are on wait lists for surgeries and they're having to travel for surgeries, things like that? Are companies like this and is technology like this going to be an answer?
Yeah, so we know that in New Zealand, we are facing, and around the world, we're facing increasing costs of healthcare because we have ageing populations. And here we currently spend about 10% of our GDP on healthcare. And so part of the solution is finding things that will save us money and reduce costs over time while delivering good outcomes. What we've seen so far is because the investment in these is so significant that they're in major hospitals. So we see that they're in places like Auckland and big hospitals, but you wouldn't expect at this point to see one somewhere small, but that people could travel, I guess. If you can get your operations done more quickly and more efficiently in major centres, I guess that shortens wait time, that gets more patients through the system, get their procedures out the door. So part of the solution is really in finding, I guess, more efficient ways to deliver better care.
What's their bedside manner like?
I'm not sure. And I guess that the other thing that's kind of interesting is you asked about, I guess, performance of these companies.
Yeah.
And when you look at Intuitive Surgical, it has been an awesome performer. And so its shares are up 60% this year. And then if you zoom out and look over the past decade, its shares have delivered an average 25% return per year. So that is massive outperformance compared to the S&P 500, which has delivered around a 12% return. But then if you look at the orthopedic companies, it's been more mixed. So instead of there being one main leader, there's two, Stryker and Zimmer, which are competing. And this year, Stryker's shares are up 30%, whereas Zimmer shares are actually down 10%.
What's the difference? Why are some doing well and others not?
Yeah, and so it's about a few factors. So Zimmer has gone through a period of mismanagement. It's been losing market share to Stryker, and then also it's just it's had production issues and shipment delays, so it's kind of disappointed investors.
Right.
And if you zoom out again over a 10-year period, Stryker has outperformed the S&P 500. It's delivered a return of around 16%. But if you held shares in Zimmer Biomet from 2015 till now, you would have generated approximately a 0% return. So it just goes to show that you can have a company in a really interesting space, but they need to be executing really well. They need to be gaining market share. Investors need to be confident about their growth prospects. So just because they're in an interesting space doesn't necessarily always mean they make a good investment.
Yeah, you need to have the idea plus the execution.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And if a company's mismanaged, then and losing market share and disappointing investors,
Doesn't matter what industry you're in, it's not a good story.
it's
is it?
not a good story. Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, this is fascinating, and I genuinely hope that this can obviously do something for investors in terms of returns, but also maybe do something for our healthcare system as well, because Lord knows we need it.
I know, we definitely do.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming back on the podcast. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
That is Dr. Deborah Lambie, who is not only an analyst at Milford, but also a medical doctor. What else can't she? She's probably going to be doing surgeries next. That is it for this week. Hopefully given you some food for thought. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week. Have a great one.